Hi, y'all. I'm Atticus, a bookseller at Literati bookstore and the host for tonight's event. This evening, we are pleased to welcome Kristina Gorcheva-Newberry, pardon me, I'm sorry, at our At Home Literati series in support of What Isn't Remembered. She'll begin conversation with Megan Cummins. For our attendees, the chat is closed, but I will be dropping the link to purchase What Isn't Remembered from Literati throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature on your toolbar to submit questions at any time. I'll ask a selection of them at the conclusion of the event, so just post that in there whenever you'd like. A reminder that you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com and for curbside pickup, as well as shipping to your home anywhere in the United States. And now, please let me introduce tonight's author and moderator. Kristina's work has appeared in Electric Literature, Indiana Review, the Southern Review, and elsewhere. Awards include the Raj Schumacher Prairie Schooner Book Award for Fiction, the 2013 Catherine Ann Porter Prize for Fiction, and the 2015 Tennessee Williams Scholarship. Her debut novel, The Orchard, will be published in the Ballantine Penguin Random House in spring of 2022. Gorcheva-Newberry lives with her family, splitting time between Brooklyn, Bland, Virginia, and Moscow. Megan Cummins is a writer and editor living in Brooklyn. She is a graduate at the University of Michigan, UC Davis, and Rutgers Newark. Her work has appeared in A Public Space, Guernica, One Teen Story, and elsewhere. Her debut story collection, If the Body Allows It, was awarded the 2019 Prairie Schooner Book Prize in Fiction and longlisted for the Penn Bingham Prize for debut short story collections. She is the managing editor of A Public Space and serves on the governing board of the Bear Life Review. Her next project is a YA novel called Aerosol. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Kristina and Megan.
Oh, thank you so much, Atticus and Literati, and of course to Kristina. Such an honor to be here to get to read with you, Kristina, and have a conversation. I just wanted to say a couple things, and then I'm going to read just a couple short things from some short pages from my book, and then turn it over to Kristina, and we'll have a conversation. But as you all here listening, please do put some questions in the Q&A. We would love to have a chance to talk with you. There will be some time at the end. But just to start, Kristina and I first connected several years ago. It was 2017. We were at AWP, which you might be familiar with, that big conference in Washington, D.C. And I had read Kristina's work before. And then we met at one of the tables in the book fair. And ever since then, I feel like I've seen Kristina's work pop up, and I have encountered it online, and then was lucky enough that she connected with me in advance of the publication of the gorgeous What Isn't Remembered, which I highly encourage you to order a copy from Literati. It's just such a stunning collection of stories. I was riveted. I was so moved. I really can't recommend this book enough, and feel so lucky to get to be here reading with Kristina. So all that to say, I feel like Kristina and I have it's almost like our writing met before we met. You know, our books won the same prize at the University of Nebraska Press and Prairie Schooner. Mine was published last year. Kristina's was published 2 weeks ago. So I feel like we've been sort of circling each other, and our work has in these past several years. And it feels like one of those serendipitous connections that I'm so happy that we are here reading together, and that I get to celebrate the launch of Kristina's book with her. And tonight we have a sort of theme that we are thinking about, and it's displacement, and the many ways that displacement can manifest in one's life, whether it's physical or emotional or political, or with one's health, whether that's emotional or physical. So we're both going to be reading from our books some things that sort of speak to that. And we feel like our work has this connection to each other through that theme and others. Though the books, in some ways are very different, in some ways they're very, very similar. And that's one of the things that I love about finding a writer that you feel connects with you and your work. So I will get to it. I won't go on too long. But I am so just to say, my book, If the Body Allows It, came out last year, and I am going to read the first story and the last story, and they're both very short. And they sort of frame the book, and they're from the point of view of the same narrator, and she pops up throughout the book. So she's a frame, she's sort of a recurring voice within the book. And these two bookends, I think, might be interesting for our conversation after. So the first very short story in the book is called Heart. The doctor looks at me and says, no fuss, no apology, that someone like me should never be pregnant. This medication, that complication, they keep on doing card tricks with your life, even when you're doing better. I can't decide whether to be relieved or devastated. What's gone is not the chance to have a baby, but the chance to decide whether or not I want a baby. So I say to my doctor, that's interesting. Afterward, the room is silent, except for the crinkling of the exam table paper and the bubbling of the keyboard as the doctor finishes her notes. I make my next appointment on my way out. Marie, Marie, I spell for the receptionist when she doesn't hear me. I sit alone in my car and glide through New Jersey toward the Newark brownstone where I live. I think of the time I lied and told a cashier at Meijer that I had a daughter. This was in Ann Arbor during college years ago. The years since seem to have come and gone without even taking off their coats. The cashier asked me if I had a sick kid at home when the 10 bottles of Pedialyte I was buying wobbled down the conveyor belt, fluorescent against the night outside, little lies themselves. I said yes, and the cashier, I remember her hair was the color of the inside of an almond, asked how old, and I said 11. The lie emerged from my mouth sure of itself, but it was a ridiculous lie, the type of lie that would capsize you, the type of lie that makes people believe they know everything about you. I was only 21, after all. I was buying the Pedialyte for Octavia, who was my roommate, not my child, and her colon was full of bleeding ulcers. The Meijer was familiar to us. We'd been shopping there for years, but now Octavia was bedridden, and in many ways I'd gotten used to doing everything with her, so it felt strange to wander the bright, empty aisles alone. Only 1 month earlier, we'd decided, she and I, that it would be wise to go grocery shopping in a blizzard. This was before she got sick, before I got sick, before her father died, and before mine did too. Before we both left Michigan and lost each other in the world, and back when writing was easier because I didn't have anything to write about. Maybe the blizzard was telling us, stay home, girls, and let the world do its worst, but not yet to you. Instead, we flew through the aisles, staticky with excitement because we loved this kind of daily danger back then and beckoned it. By the time we were outside, the wind was busy rearranging the world. The wheels of the cart tried to trample the snowdrifts, those piles of uncarved marble looking bright and starved on the asphalt. She pulled the cart and I pushed. Our laughter was crinkled cut and captured by the wind, carried to the stars, which I seem to recall shining brightly, which is impossible, but still, that's how I remember it. The constellations looking down on us through the white silk of the storm, as though we were their only constituents, the two of us in our plastic bags that flapped in the wind like wild beating hearts. Then we drove home on the icy roads and we were completely fine. As I angle my car into its spot in Newark, a light precipitation falls somewhere between snow and rain. I kill the engine and sit in the car, which ticks as it cools, surrounded by the quiet midday street. Ralph, my boyfriend, is gone for the day, and when he gets home, we'll pick up where we left off in our daily arguing. I should get on the train and go to work for the afternoon like I said I would, but I might call in. I want to call Octavia, but she and I lost touch years ago. I've heard she's better. I've heard she has a baby. I'll probably cry in the shower later. There's nothing wrong with crying in the shower sometimes, even when you're in your 30s, especially when you're in your 30s. Back then, I'd been embarrassed by the lie. Now I think it might have felt good to shock someone, if only briefly, to have a secret life. The cashier had stared at me when I said the made-up age, 11, and the look in her eyes had said she could do nothing for me but tell me how much I owed. That is Heart, the first story, and I will just flip to the last one, also from that character Marie's point of view, and it's called Skeleton. After many years of silence between us, I called my friend from college, Octavia, the one I had bought Pedialyte for that night at the grocery store. I find myself recalling the phone conversation at a reading I give in the city not long after I publish my book. The story comes out as a response to a question asked by an audience member. What feelings went into writing this book? She had said, and as I stare at her serious face, I realize she's not joking. She really wants to know. I can't recall all my feelings, and the longer the silence extends, the more I think I may never have had a feeling in my life. That was when I started my way into the anecdote. The story gets too long, and the audience looks as though they regret not slipping out of the bookstore before the start of the Q&A. Each passing moment is an opportunity for me to stop talking, an opportunity I glide right past. So Octavia's the real name of the character named Maylie in the book, I say. I mean, the character is real, the story is not real, but you know what I mean. Anyway, for a long time, we were very close. I'd heard bits of news about Octavia here and there, but I found her contact information right after I got pregnant and decided to end the pregnancy. Amina, my friend, is sitting in the front row, her eyes widen. She presses her fist to her mouth and shakes her head nearly imperceptibly. When I called Octavia, her voice sounded far away. She'd gone off social media for good years ago, so she hadn't heard anything about my life since we last spoke, which was when Ralph and I still lived in Michigan, and she'd just moved to California to teach in San Francisco. She hadn't heard that I'd also gotten sick with an autoimmune disorder like hers, and she hadn't heard my father had died. She said she felt like we'd been living parallel lives 3,000 miles apart. I stumbled through backstory so the conversation will make sense to the audience in the bookstore. I say Octavia and I talked about how we weren't the first people in the world who've gotten sick and whose fathers have died, but sometimes it feels like our loneliness is unparalleled, and so we try to make connections, to turn coincidence into fate in order to fill the empty spaces. But instead of feeling a sense of understanding, the empty spaces just grow the more we try to connect and analyze them. Until you find the right person to help you through it, that is, I say. For Octavia, that person was her husband, who introduced her to Jesus. She says she's found peace that way. I'm telling the truth when I say I wish I was a believer the way she is, I tell the audience, and for some reason they laugh. No, I mean it. And they laugh even more. Anyway, I go on. I told Octavia about how I wanted not to tell the father. I knew what I wanted. As we spoke, I imagined Octavia in the apartment she shared with her husband and son. They're in Los Angeles now. I don't know what the apartment looks like, but I can see citrus trees in the yard, the lemons sunning themselves, round grapefruits almost the size of basketballs, and baby blue curtains billowing above the windows. She'd known Ralph. She and I were roommates when I met him, and she asked me if I thought I could work things out with him. Oh no, I say to her on the phone. That was years ago. He married someone else. So anyway, I say to the audience, I told Octavia about the baby, and I wish I could have told my father. As an afterthought, I add, my father would have been a good grandfather. So that was it, I say to the audience in the bookstore. That was one of the feelings that made me write this book. It's the feeling that life is always on the brink of never being the same again. And sometimes pieces of our lives fall off the edge, but some things, good and bad, we carry with us after the crash. And those things make us who we are. And then you find something or someone that helps you survive and persevere. For me, it was trying to write this book with hope. I mean, I add, there is friendship and hope in this book, right? I mean, did you get that if you read it? I sound desperate by now. I know I should stop talking, let the audience go, release their attention before they're forced to stumble through the rows of chairs, coats in hand, trying to sneak out quietly while pretending they had to leave early all along. Did that answer your question? I ask. The woman who asked the question nods. Silence inflates in the room, a giant suffocating balloon. No one has any other questions, and it's time for me to thank the audience for coming and let them disperse to bars, to laugh about how awkward I was, how I used the reading as an excuse to share my emotions, or to forget about the reading entirely and immediately. But I hold on to the silence. There's a feeling I was hoping for when I didn't get tonight. I'm searching the faces for someone who might give it to me. Tonight is a night my father would have been proud of me. I'm yearning to glimpse that glow of pride in someone's eyes. I can't find it anywhere, And it's not because the people here despise me, as I worry they do, but simply because none of them is my father. And the longer I look, the less likely it seems that I'll find him. That's the last story in the book. Thank you so much for listening. And I will turn it over to Kristina, who's going to read from her beautiful book now.
Thank you, Megan. These were one of my favorite stories in your collection, especially the first one. Very heartfelt, personal. But, we talked earlier about the theme of displacement and how we go away and sometimes never return home, but we're looking for those homes in our fictions, right, in our stories, and we try to recreate them, even though everything is fictional. The characters are fictional, the situations are fictional. Well, some details might be real, but we're trying to recreate again and again the worlds we have left, and in some cases, the worlds that no longer are. So tonight I will read from the suicide note. And I think this story speaks powerfully to that theme of displacement. And also it is a fairly new story, maybe 4 years old. 5 years old. I wrote that story when I first moved to Brooklyn. And there is indeed Fresh Market on Myrtle, and where I often shopped. And so that place also informed my being in Brooklyn, because I've been living in Virginia for such a long time, and then I moved to Brooklyn. And I also felt displaced somewhat. Suicide note. I had been living in Brooklyn for a few months when I met Sarah. She came to shop at Fresh Market on Myrtle, where I worked 6 days a week from noon to midnight. It was early December, the city dusted with snow, garlands of lights looped around windows and lampposts. My co-workers and I had just finished decorating a small artificial tree by the entrance. It appeared lopsided, with flimsy paper ornaments caught in a swirl of wind each time a customer walked in or out. An angel sat crooked on the very top. In her knee-length fur coat, Sarah stood in front of the tree for a moment before raising her cane to adjust the angel. To my surprise, she was able to reach it without much effort, but now the angel leaned to the other side. She kept fussing with the cane until the winged creature appeared dead center. "That's better," she said. "Whoever put you up there didn't try hard." That whoever was me, but I didn't volunteer the information. Instead, I offered her a shopping cart someone had abandoned in the aisle. She asked if she could order a fresh turkey. We had turkeys, frozen though, but she shook her head. "I need fresh. My son is coming home for the holidays. I want to cook up a feast." As half Russian, half Ukrainian, I occasionally had trouble pronouncing English words or hearing them correctly. So I asked, "You're cooking a beast, animal?" Sarah wrinkled her forehead. Her skin resembled recycled parchment paper, creased and thin. "Where are you from, young man?" she asked. "Russia?" "Thought so, your accent." She had a sharp nose and dark, solemn eyes. Slouching over her right ear, a black beret covered all of her head, so it was hard to guess what color her hair was. Her eyebrows were painted brown, one longer than the other. She looked slim under the lustrous bulk of her coat, with delicate wrists and glossy maroon nails. She must have been 80 or older, somewhere close to the lip of eternity, as my mother would have said. "I'll ask about fresh turkeys and let you know in a day or two if you leave your phone number," I said. She nodded, and I spent the next 15 minutes following her around the store, reaching for various staples on high shelves. She kept her feet wide apart and moved slowly. "I had both hips replaced, in case you're wondering," she said. Her husky, crackling voice made me think of trees, dead trees. "Oh, wow. Does it still hurt?" I asked. "No, but my marathon days are over." I gave her a compassionate look. "Sorry." "Don't be. I hate marathons. At least there's no pressure now. My son, on the other hand, always runs places." When she said that, I thought of my father constantly rushing out, always late for work, for gatherings, and even for my grandmother's funeral, how I'd almost missed my plane to America because he'd been late driving me to the airport. When Sarah finished shopping, her cart brimmed with produce, fingerling potatoes, avocados, asparagus, pomegranates, persimmons, artisan cheeses, smoked fish, milk, cranberry juice, crackers, a stick of salami, chocolate chip cookies, a vanilla gelato. One would think she had a house full of famished guests. I suggested delivery. Will it be you or somebody else? I'd rather it be you, she said. I'll ask the manager if it isn't too far. No, just across the road, Bridge Street. I wrote down her address on one of the bags and she left, unhurriedly climbing up the ramp. Late in the evening, the store was empty. One of the cashiers yawned while scrolling down on her phone. The other devoted her attention to a peeling strip of her fake nail. They were my age, 29, also immigrants. But unlike me, they had their naturalization papers in order. They were half Mexican, half Puerto Rican, with glowing skin and thick robes of hair. One had a scar above her eyebrow, the other a parrot tattoo on her shoulder that stayed naked even in the winter. Her sweater pulled low. Out the window, the girls showed me Sarah's building. She lived in Beltel Lofts, an Art Deco tower originally constructed as the headquarters of the New York Telephone Company. I needed a cart since I didn't own a car or even a bicycle. If you run away with our cart, you are in deep shit, the girl with the scar said. What would I do with it? Sell it to Target? I joked, but they didn't laugh. Yet again, I thought how hard it was to make someone laugh in a foreign language. And if you couldn't laugh together, how could you live together? In that sense, America remained a mystery to me. Oh, and when she talks about her son, the other girl said, pretend that you don't know he's dead. He's dead? I asked and felt the weight of Sarah's bags in my hands. Yeah. Cancer? No, the girl with the scar said. He killed himself. Drugs, the other said. Overdosed? I asked. Yeah, on purpose. He left a suicide note. What did it say? I asked. They both shrugged. Don't know. There used to be a guy here. He and Sarah's son, they were buddies. He mentioned the note. You took his job, the girl with the tattoo said. He wasn't illegal or anything, but he sort of broke down, started drinking and doping. Well, I do neither, I said. No, Vladimir, you're more dangerous. You invade countries and hijack elections. They laughed, and I felt a prickle of needles in my spine. The store closed at 11, but I always stayed later to clean up or restock the shelves or just stretch Glad wrap over sliced deli meats. I washed floors too, wiped foggy, fingerprinted coolers, took trash out and plastered food advertisements over the windows. I also replaced light bulbs, sorted and discarded rotten produce, swept tables and benches in the back of the store. In short, I did anything the manager asked me to do and for as little money as he could pay an illegal immigrant. No, I didn't cross the Mexican border on foot, nor did I enter the country in the belly of a giant ship hidden in barrels of dead fish. My arrival was more prosaic and less strenuous. I entered America legally on a 3-month tourist visa, and then I ended up overstaying it by 9 years. I brought some money with me from counterfeiting Levi's jeans and selling them in one of Moscow's markets. I couldn't afford much, but it was enough to carry me into another year until I found a job that paid cash. When I had first arrived, I lived with a former classmate in DC. He was a student at George Mason University, a tall, dorky, 20-year-old virgin with Stalin's mustache. We were getting along beautifully until my roommate fell in love, and his girlfriend, a short, plump American from Southwest Virginia, insisted he give up his former life for his future one. Vodka, pickles, and black bread for hamburgers, Coke, and apple pie. She moved in and I moved out, and my classmates stopped speaking Russian even to me. Still, I didn't want to return home and listen to my mother accusing my father of stealing her youth, or my father accusing of my mother of stealing her country. His country, of her forcing her Russianness on his Ukrainianness. I preferred distance and virtual love, Skype visits. As I pushed the cart towards Sarah's building, it began to snow again, the flurries landing on my cheeks and lips, a taste of home in my mouth. Across the street, crowned with a red star, a giant Christmas tree stood wrapped in lights. I remembered the last New Year's Eve before I left. A scrawny pine my mother and I had tied to an old sled and dragged through the snow. My father, drunk and asleep in the bathroom. I thought of Sarah and how bizarre it was that she spoke of her son as though he was still alive, while my mother referred to my father as though he were dead. She always mentioned things in past tense, and at some point I stopped correcting her. When Sarah opened the door, I hesitated for a moment because the person in front of me was almost entirely bald. A few strands of remaining hair were held back with bobby pins. Her apartment smelled of melted wax and a hint of incense, yet I saw no candles. In fact, her home was cold and dark, like a cave. I noted no ceiling lights anywhere, which was something I'd encountered in DC and other American cities. It puzzled me because I had always thought it was a Russian thing to keep people in the dark. In the kitchen, I placed the grocery bags on the counter. On the other end of the room, a petite square table and 2 chairs sat next to the window, a few large ships stranded in the distance, a shimmer of lights along the shore, the jagged outline of lower Manhattan, like a pop-up Christmas card. Wow, I said, what a view. The Statue of Liberty is over there, right? I pointed between the 2 skinny buildings. She shrugged. Whoever thought of putting it there? Her home was larger than expected in a city this crowded. I saw no decorations, though, no tree. Oriental rugs covered the floors. The oak furniture seemed old, frayed, and heavy, yet somehow befitting the apartment. The tall ceilings and soundproof windows. For the first time since I arrived in New York, I couldn't hear a shrill of sirens or the hum of exhaust fans. I was entombed in silence. The apartment had 3 bedrooms, although one without windows. And for some reason, I thought that it must have been the room where her son had killed himself. His pictures were displayed everywhere, but they were mostly baby pictures and a few of a teenager with crooked teeth and red clown hair. Pointing at the 2 of them in a gaudy piazza ambushed by pigeons, I asked, "How old is your son in that picture?" 18. We went to Europe right after his graduation. I wanted to show him the other side of the world. I'm German, you know. My parents fled the country right before the war. When she said that, I felt a pang of resentment. I was 3 generations removed from the war, but like most Russian-born citizens, I grew up celebrating Victory Day and watching military parades in Red Square. "And your husband?" I asked. "Is he also German?" "No, American. He died of cancer when Robert was 10. "Do you ever go back to Germany?" "Not once. I didn't learn the language either, although my parents spoke it at home. I understood everything, but I refused to speak it. When my mother picked me up from school, I insisted she didn't talk. Robert, on the other hand, took German in college." "What does he do?" I asked, marveling at how easy it was to pretend that Robert was alive because nothing in Sarah's home contradicted her lie. My question, however, caught her off guard, so she paused, adjusting her turtleneck sweater, pushing the sleeves down and then up, all the way above her sharp elbows. Her skin was white like snow and also translucent, a plexus of veins crawling up her arms. "Robert is an artist, a painter. He lives in California," she finally said. "Come, I'll show you." In the corner room, with triple windows, the floor was protected with an old stained sheet. Everywhere against the walls, drawings and paintings leaned in no particular order, nudes and landscapes, a still life with apples and a dead bird. There was nothing remarkable in those paintings, as far as I could tell, except maybe for the aggressiveness and juxtaposition of colors, fairy orange against seaweed green, against raspberry red. I remembered that in his youth, my father also wanted to be an artist, but my mother always said that he had no vision. He could mix paints, a new technique, but lacked imagination. He ended up being a mechanic and worked on trains. Brushes lay on the floor, used rags and tubes of paints. I stepped over them, walking up to a small desk cluttered with colored pencils, erasers, and notepads. I viewed a life-size hand carved from a pale chunk of wood, and next to it, a face cast in white plaster, a kind of a death mask. Eyes shut, lips too, the rest of the features smooth and perfectly delineated. Staring at it made me uncomfortable. I knew it couldn't be her son's face, although, did I? I switched to the easel that displayed an empty canvas. initialed at the bottom. There was nothing else on it, yet I kept thinking that I could see something if I looked hard enough. It's called 433 after John Cage, Sarah said. I turned my face to her. Who? An American composer, taught at the New School here in New York. One of his pieces has no notes and lasts 4 minutes and 33 seconds. A performer just sits in front of a piano and does nothing. We're forced to listen to the sounds around us. It's a kind of rebellion against social norms. That's a lot of, I was going to say shit, but said emptiness. Well, it's part of the automatism movement, when the artist wishes to remove himself from the process of creation to achieve higher truth, because self-expression is really nothing more than an infusion of the art with the social standards to which we have been subjected since birth. Nothing original can come from that. My son says that about painting too, how light touches a blank canvas, bearing its irregularities, darker or lighter threads, perhaps even an occasional defect or a shadow. We're forced to study a pure, original form the artist can't control in any way. It's the art of seeing. I stared at her. The ardor with which she spoke about the blank canvas and her dead son commanded respect. In my family, no one spoke of anything with such veneration. My mother cursed profusely while gossiping about her co-workers, their many sex scandals. My father drank on weekends and watched political talk shows, which my mother called impotent or sterile. I walked to a tall bookshelf in the far corner of the room. I guessed them to be books on painting, and some of them were, as well as on famous artists, Klim, Shelley, Kandinsky, Magritte, but most of the books were literally epics: Moby Dick, War and Peace, Grapes of Wrath, A Farewell to Arms, To the Lighthouse. These are Roberts, Sarah said. I pulled out the last book with a woman and the sea on the cover. Is this one good? Yes, remarkable. Is the author still alive? Virginia Woolf drowned in 1941 in London during a bombing raid, I believe. She went swimming while, I was going to say Germans, but said Nazis bombed the place. No, she killed herself, filled her pockets with stones and walked into the river. Can you imagine the strength? Maybe she was murdered, I said. Happens in my country a lot. I doubt it. There was a suicide note. What did it say? I have no idea. Google it. There was a moment of silence between us, so I said what my mother often said. Strange how the echo of that war is still here, still haunting us. Yes, Sarah said. It's hard to faith them sometimes. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Kristina. That was so fabulous to hear you read that piece out loud. It's one of my favorites from the book, and there's so much to talk about. So I thought we could sort of just dive right in, and I would love to ask you a couple questions about that piece. So I was thinking about it. I was looking at it again before we hopped on Zoom, and then hearing you read, I was taking notes. I feel like there are so much more I want to talk about. And I thought I would start with that last line you ended on, which is not the last line of the story for those of you joining us. And I won't spoil anything, but one thing I wrote down in my notebook is how when Sarah first mentions the war and that her parents had left beforehand, Vlad gets a pang of resentment, which I think is so interesting. And then how they come to agree here at the end of what you read, how that war is still echoing, all these generations later. And that would just really, those two lines really stuck out to me. How that initial pang, it's involuntary, but then as the story goes on, they come to unpack that a little bit. So war, even across generations, is this force of displacement in this story. So I was just wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that, or say just a few more words about how you were thinking about the war when writing this story.
Well, grew up in the Soviet Union and World War II and Great Patriotic War, which is part of World War II. It's probably the most devastating thing that had happened to my country and the Soviet people. Of course, there was Stalin and there were gulags. And before that, 1917, there was revolution. But that war claimed 27 million people, Soviet people.
Wow.
I think the total casualties all over the world were like 55 million. But Stalin and gulags killed 20 million. So we're talking that in 10 years, the country lost close to 50 million people. So that's what the entire world lost in World War II. So I grew up with stories of the war. My grandfather, of course, went through the entire war, came back in 1945. My grandmother and my aunt survived the war. And, they didn't talk much about it, but it was always present. So my generation, the echo of that war lives on. I think that after perestroika and all that happened to the country, the focus had shifted somewhat. And I think it has been revived in the past, maybe, 5 or 7 years. And some people say, well, it's propaganda. I don't think so. I think it's tragedy. And in fact, when I came here, I was surprised how little is known about World War II and how little is taught at schools. But my husband's uncle, my husband's father did go to that war, but the uncle was too young. But I remember when I first came and we went to meet him, that's the first thing he told me. He kind of pulled me to the couch and he said, if it hadn't been for your people, we would have been polishing Nazis' boots now. And that was an American man in his late 70s telling me that. So I was really shocked to hear that. Again, because later on I encountered how little is known about that war and how little is discussed. However, the echoes of that war, I don't think the echoes have ever left my country. I don't think the echoes have ever left the world, including America. And in fact, I think that the Cold War was the direct result of the World War II. Mm. And even now, what we have, the relationship between Russia and America, I think carries the echoes of World War II. So
that's so interesting. And what you say, I remember in high school, this was the early aughts. We read, there was we used to get Time magazine for kids. They had a monthly kind of insert or something. And there was an article in there about how some very large percent, maybe not very large percent, but sort of astonishing percent of American kids or teenagers didn't know that, the US and the Soviet Union had fought both on the Allied side. And I think that was that echo of the Cold War, sort of right. Giving that perspective. And I just want to say, I'm so interested in what you said about, it's not propaganda, it's tragedy. The idea of tragedy sort of hiding itself or masking itself as propaganda is, I'm just putting that out there because it sort of struck me and is so interesting. I feel like it's something to unpack. Absolutely, in your book and just in general. Thank you for answering that. That was so interesting. And I just want to say, so speaking of Sarah and Vlad and this moment of connection they have, I want to go back and think about Sarah, the first time we see her, and that sort of hilarious moment where she's adjusting the angel with her cane. And actually, the first person, I didn't quite connect until you read it out loud. The first person or thing that she talks to in the story is the angel, which is so interesting. And I think just such a good piece of characterization. Sorry, I don't mean to be, I'm long-winded and get into my question, but that I think it really demonstrates what a force of a character she is. And then at first I was sort of, as I was thinking about the story again, I was like, oh, I wonder, like, why does Vlad sort of go to her house? You know, like, why does Vlad throughout the story sort of like make this connection with her? And then hearing you read it, I was like, you know what? It might be Sarah actually that chooses Vlad. So these two characters who are, for different reasons and also some of the same reasons, finding themselves alone on Christmas in New York. How did you create that relationship as a writer? Sort of what were you thinking about when crafting these two very different characters who are also very similar in some ways?
Well, they did connect through my favorite novel, To the Lighthouse, right? There's a suicide note that he reads, right? That Virginia Woolf wrote to her husband. And one of the lines, and it is included in the story, one of the lines there, it says that the two people could have not been happier together than us. You know, that line, every time I think of that line, and that she wrote it before she killed herself, I can't imagine what she went through. I can't imagine the loneliness, and her loneliness. I can't imagine Leonard's loneliness when he read that note and when her body was discovered. So I think that's what guided me. Those characters are very lonely. Did they choose to be lonely? I don't think so. I think in a way they may have chose solitude, but the loneliness, the social loneliness, the familial loneliness, it has been imposed on them. On Sarah, because her husband dies, and then her son. And you know, later on, we do realize that she did have not the best of relationships with her son. We don't know whether she is to blame or the son is to blame, but somehow they became lonely, and even lonelier together that the son kills himself. But she pretends that he's alive to spare herself that loneliness. You know, that's all she has, the memory of that child that she raised and the things they did together. Although I think all of those memories that are less painful are going back to his childhood and his teenage years. That's why all the pictures she has of him going back to the happy times. But there are no pictures of him older, because those times are already not happy. So we understand that they somehow drifted apart. If you go back to Vlad, and we know later that he feels that he is not loved by his family, and that he doesn't love them either, that all they did was arguing about who owes who. You know, my country is better, no, my country is better, you did this, I did this. So in that argument, trying to win, you know, the dominancy in the family. You know, the mother thought she was right, the father thought he was right. They lost their child. So the child preferred to be an illegal immigrant, to earn what he could by doing everything he could, right? Living in a small, tiny, crappy place, because we know he lives in some tiny apartment. Actually, he lives in a room, not even an apartment. And he goes to Sarah, you know, delivers that turkey in the end, right? Because he wants her to cook him a meal, because he doesn't remember anyone cooking him a meal or, you know, mothering him. And in fact, we find out in the next scene that the mother took to the church all his belongings, because, you know, he no longer lived there. So they're profoundly lonely people. And we do feel lonely or lonelier during the holidays, right? It's when the suicide rates peak, right? So that, I think that was, that's what I thought. And of course, to the lighthouse made its way there. And, the character does think that how, she loved Virginia Woolf. Even before she died, she loved her husband so much that she bothered to write that note where, had something happened to him, nobody would care. So.
That's so striking. And you mentioned the mother who took all these things to the church. But right before that, there's that line where she says that she left his sheets on his bed for a month, which was so interesting for her as a character. She argues, right, my country's better, no, my country's better. And she gossips about her coworkers. And then there's this sort of moment where she leaves his sheets on the bed, almost as though he is, as though he's died, but he's not dead, which is sort of, it's so layered because it's like, well, he left, but he's not gone, but she sort of grieves him as though he is. And then does that like about face of like, okay, we're cleaning it out, we're getting it out, we're getting rid of that bad memory, but he's not actually dead. And I feel like that speaks so strongly to the way that he was displaced from his family, because between the fighting of his parents, he never found a home, and so goes and finds his own. And so there's that interesting parallel there before his his mother treating his departure almost like a suicide, and then the way that Sarah treats her son's suicide by continuing to try to nurture and repair, even if things were not good, at the end for whatever reasons. Such a stark, interesting difference between those two mothers, and so fascinating. But yes, that I feel like I'm sorry, I just can't stop. There are so many questions I want to ask about your book, but I mean, I did want to say, the conversation about displacement and about sort of the suicides and the suicides notes and the title of your story. Thinking about my book, it's one thing that I was thinking about was because obviously displacement works in my book in some different ways. The character obviously is not, she's not an immigrant. She's left home, but she still lives in America. And one thing is that her father has died, and she has become sick with an autoimmune disease. And I was thinking, as I was thinking about our theme, about how, and thinking about your story, and the idea of a suicide note and that final sort of note, is that the only sort of, you can be displaced in so many ways. A person can be displaced in so many ways, but the only way you can completely be displaced from your body is death. But autoimmunity, which is sort of a big theme in my book, is the body rejecting itself. The body is attacking itself. And I just saw this parallel between Vlad's parents almost like attacking him with their fighting and displacing him in that way. And autoimmunity as, you're still alive, but your body is trying to displace you. Vlad still has a home, but his parents, all their efforts have displaced him. And I suppose I don't really have a question there, but that was just something I was thinking about as you were reading.
Right. So he's ostracized, from his family.
Yeah.
So he's just sort of, they push them away, whether on purpose or not. Some things are done with the best intention and they end up being the worst that a person could do, and vice versa. So, but yes, he is largely displaced and ostracized. And I think he feels just as alone and just as lonely as Sarah. And ultimately, that's the connection between them. And he has no problem, he pretends her son is alive. He goes along with her, but he also comes to her home because he's, interested in that suicide note. He wants to see, what did they say? I mean, what? But of course, and I was thinking about when I wrote the story and I revised it. I was thinking about him finding the note when he finds Sarah and thinks she's dead, but she's not. And then there's a piece of paper he picks up from the floor, and he thinks it's got to be the suicide note, hers or her son's, right? That she holds close. But there's nothing on that paper. It's empty. It's like the life that's ended, right? There's nothing there. It's nothingness. And I think sometimes the nothingness is even more terrifying than the words that someone leaves.
Wow. Oh, yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, that moment stuck with me so much when and the way you describe it in the book, you guys, you have to buy this book to read the story. He sees a blank piece of paper and he flips it over, anticipating that, well, maybe she wrote the suicide note and turned it over.
Right.
And it's that, what you say about nothingness being even more lonely, as horrible and grim and tragic, there's the sort of, finality of a note, and also the stories that get built around it. There's Virginia Woolf's, that her famous suicide note, of course, but then on a much more local scale, even the suicide note of Sarah's son is part of the story of the grocery store, and people know about it, even if they don't know what it said. They mention, he left a note. And it sort of builds the story in that way, which it doesn't make it less tragic or easier, but it gives something to, I don't know, maybe not hold on to is not the right word, but something to think about. I don't know. It's
Right. But also, as writers, that's what we fear most, right? The blank page.
Yeah.
When we can no longer feel it. So, and in some ways, I think I feel sometimes that all our stories are our suicide notes. We send them into the world. We just say, okay, this is the best I wrote. Here it goes. And yet we continue. We go on living, and I think that's what we fear most. The blank screen, blank page. Then we have no desire to feel it. So that nothingness, to me, is terrifying.
Yeah.
And when I wrote the story, the more I thought about it, the more I knew that he would not find Robert's suicide note, even if it existed, because the girls weren't sure. And they just said, well, somebody said this. And the more I realized that he had to find that blank piece of paper, because the nothingness, the blankness, what comes after, right? It's worse.
Yeah.
What they possibly have now, he and Sarah. And so that blank piece of paper kind of connects them too. And it also, if he thinks about himself when he finds that piece of paper, he imagines his parents and what would happen, if he, died or killed himself, and, how, things are irrevocable. You cannot repair that. And how, his mother would attack the father, and how there's not a word would pass between them. It's, the tragedy of a family that becomes a nothingness, ultimately.
Right.
So.
Wow. We if anybody does have a question, I don't think we have any Q&As, but do feel free to pop it in. We have a minute or two left, but but also that feels like a pretty final place. I mean, place to end the evening, Kristina, which was such a fabulous reading, it, and always so wonderful to hear you talk about your book.
Thank you, Megan. It was wonderful to talk to you and listen to you read. Because I get to listen to you read very often. During the pandemic, things have gotten harder.
Yeah. The last story set in a Q&A, I wrote that before the pandemic, which it's in person, people are jostling coats, chairs, and I'm like, different,
Right.
different than reality now, but one day. So
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. It's been an honor. Kristina and Megan, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you all for joining us at Home with Literati tonight. Thank you to all of our viewers, and make sure to buy What Isn't Remembered. The link I will post in the chat right now. Great, awesome. And thank you both so much. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you so much. Thank
right.
you.
bye.
Bye-bye.